Good afternoon and welcome to the Aurora Public Library District's three-part series of the Cemeteries of Aurora. I'm Robb Winder, Genealogy Local History Specialist, and I will be your host as we explore some history, lore, and photographs from Aurora's burial grounds. We begin here with a quote from Aurora Cemeteries 1837 to 1987, which states, "A cemetery is a history of people, a perpetual record of yesterday, and a sanctuary of peace and quiet today. A cemetery exists because every life is worth loving and remembering, always." This presentation begins a multi-part series of the burial grounds located in the city of Aurora. Currently, there are 9 cemeteries within our city. They are Calvary, Marywood or Annunciation, Mount Olivet, Root Street, also known as East, St. Joseph, St. Michael, St. Nicholas, Spring Lake, and West Aurora. One even older cemetery was Aurora's original burial ground, and that was located near the corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets. According to historians, most of those interred here were Native Americans. As the city grew, LaSalle Street Cemetery was closed, and sometime in the 1850s, it was decided to open the land up for other development. As a result, many of the remains were transferred to Root Street plots. Even so, when the city began work to grade Benton Street for paving, a good number of remains were exhumed, and for some years the rain washing down the embankment to the south would expose human bones, as the old settlers still recount. Nothing remains of this first Aurora cemetery. For this first segment of these presentations, I will focus on those burial grounds located in the northeast portion of the city, defining the area as north of New York Street and east of the Fox River. Being a librarian, of course, I have to deal with them alphabetically, so we begin with Marywood. Marywood Cemetery is easily one of the best maintained and most attractive of the burial grounds in Aurora. It is located on Church Road behind the Annunciation Catholic Church. Marywood is the only graveyard in Aurora that fits the strictest definition of the word. In its truest meaning, a graveyard describes a cemetery that is attached to a church. In more colloquial use, the word has come to cover any burial site. Any discussion of Marywood Cemetery must provide a bit of information on those settlers who moved to the area in the middle years of the 19th century. The church and graveyard were established to serve the number of German-speaking Luxembourgers who settled nearby in the Big Woods area. These people left a small, overcrowded European nation in which there was little opportunity for many people to make much of a living. Those who settled in the Big Woods encouraged others from their homeland to consider Kane County as a fine place to start life anew, and several from across the pond answered that call. The first arrival was Philip Jungles. His stone, by the way, is actually not here at Marywood, it is at St. Nicholas. Jungles came in 1850 and was followed by his brothers George and John. The next year, Peter and John Hankus, Michael Frieders, and Peter Pettit joined the colony. 1852 was an even bigger year as Henry Lees, Matthias, John, and Nicholas Molitor, Matthias, Peter, and Nicholas Reckinger, Lorenz and Nicholas Krantz, and Nicholas, John, Matthias, and Stephen Fiddler moved to the Big Woods. Thanks to the abundance of timber and demand from the railroads for these families flourished, but there was still a major problem. This was a very religious community, and their choices for Catholic services were severely limited. They could travel the 9-mile distance to Saints Peter and Paul in Naperville, or attempt to ford the Fox River for church in West Aurora. By 1863, there were sufficient numbers of Luxembourgers in the area to get a German-language Catholic church established at St. Nicholas. Still, road conditions were an issue, and when a woman on her way to services was killed crossing the railroad tracks, the community pushed to have an even closer option. By 1875, there were approximately 65 families living in the Big Woods. Through their toil and sacrifice, their desire for a more accessible house of worship was made a reality. Jacob Fiddler donated 3 acres of land for a church and cemetery, and on July 25, 1875, a cornerstone ceremony was held that attracted close to 4,000 people. The monuments that went up in the graveyard are relatively plain, reflecting the thrifty character of these people, but the stones are attractive and designed in good taste. While some of them show the unmistakable signs of aging, there are no fallen stones to be seen, and that is a rarity in a cemetery of this vintage. The most notable features at Marywood are the grottos built in 1910 and 1912 from native stone. The first one is located directly behind the church, close to the cemetery gate, and the second sits in the middle portion of the original graveyard. Many of those buried here at Marywood have family names that were also a part of the migration from native Luxembourg. Early settlers like the Comases, the Millans, and the Kartheisers, as well as others, were laid to their final rest in this beautiful cemetery. There are also several graves for those who served in the military. A Diamond Jubilee salute to Annunciation from 1950 lists those buried here who paid the ultimate sacrifice, including casualties of World War I, like Michael Leake and Henry Molitor. Soldiers killed in World War II include Lieutenant William P. Mattel Jr. and Marine Bernard Blessage. Marywood today is a peaceful oasis on the northern edge of the city, and it is a tribute to the industry and dedication of those who made it a reality. The addition of more land as space filled ensures that Marywood will continue to be used for some time to come. I will conclude this portion with a few miscellaneous shots of this very fine graveyard. Now on to Root Street Cemetery. In a Let's White Now and Then Beacon article from 1932, he spoke about some newspaper clippings from a 19th century scrapbook. White determined that the information was written sometime in 1865, and the piece described the Aurora cemeteries of that time. Of Root Street, here are some portions of what was recorded. We approach by a narrow lane, and as we ascend the steps to enter, the white tops of the monuments and tombstones gleam thickly amid the surrounding foliage, presenting an attractive picture. Death loves a shining mark, we thought, as we observed so many gifted and noble minds reposing within this narrow space. The cold winds seem to have swept bitterly through the narrow paths that lead us to the eastward, for the little white marble stones rise more thickly, and scattered blossoms, lying here beneath our sight, told how the slender stems of life had become broken. Somewhere here we observe a finely carved block of pure marble representing figures of angels bending over a sleeping child, who held in his hands a bunch of fresh apple blossoms, placed there probably by an affectionate mother or sister. Near the entrance temporarily repose the remains of another whose monument can never record in fitting characters the brave deeds he performed, nor the glory and honor he won while sacrificing his life for his country. Affection will ever linger around the grave of Colonel Silas Miller. We now turn from this beautiful but abbreviated description to see what Root Street Cemetery looks like today. The natural reaction after hearing the above is, so what happened? When the cemetery opened, Aurora was still a very small community, so it must have seemed that the amount of land set aside for the burial ground would be adequate for years to come. The arrival of the railroad in 1849 brought in an influx of new citizens. Factories, tempted by the strong transportation links and cheaper land values located here, bringing in even more people. Neighborhoods sprang up, landlocking Root Street, leaving no room for expansion. After the Civil War, a newer, much larger cemetery, Spring Lake, opened on the south end of town. That one quickly became the place to bury Aurora's dead if you were from the east side. By then, virtually all of Root Street's plots had been sold, and the last known burial there was that of Burr Winton. Winton was Aurora's first postmaster, librarian, and for years served as the sexton at Root Street before his death in 1885. With his passing began an era of vandalism and neglect that took their toll. As the cemetery began to fall into disrepair, some of the remains were transferred to other burial grounds, most ending up at Spring Lake. Few records survive concerning those who were laid to rest at Root Street. By 1909, an article in the Beacon already cited the place as an eyesore and called for the removal of all the bodies interred there. The area had become something of a playground for the neighborhood children who used fallen stones for an improvised baseball field. Tombstones were moved from their original positions, so it is unclear whether the few still standing are even remotely close to their original sites. How many bodies still lie under this sad, desolate place? Who exactly, and where are they? No one knows. The first burial that took place there was George Bates, son of Charles Bates, who was buried in 1848. 1 year later, a cholera epidemic swept across America. Aurora did not escape unscathed. Almost 10% of the population here died in the epidemic. A mass grave for the local victims was situated somewhere on the Root Street grounds. While it is not definitely known where these unfortunates were buried, it is possible that they are somewhere in the southeast corner of the graveyard. This is a portion that historians believe may have been the Potter's Field, a place for transients and those who couldn't afford a cemetery plot. The land originally belonged to Charles Bates. Charles Bates donated 2 acres and convinced his father-in-law, Dr. Anson Root of Elgin, an ardent abolitionist, to add another piece of land to the parcel. A meeting of Aurora citizens took place in 1849, and among its resolutions mentions the land now occupied as a graveyard in Aurora. According to the documents that transferred the land, Root specified that if the grounds ceased being used as a cemetery, the lands would revert back to his heirs. And so, a cemetery was officially established, and for some years flourished as we saw earlier. By 1865, since much of the available space was already occupied, there was a perceived need for yet another graveyard, and Spring Lake was the result. Ugly rumors. In 1873, Dr. Frederick Pond moved to Aurora. Here he established a cancer hospital located just north of Root Street Cemetery. According to a Beacon article from November 20th, 1875, many of the cures he has effected seem little less than miraculous. Were these not for plenty of strong, robust men and women right here in our own community who have been raised from the very gates of death? The fame of Pond's successes spread, and cancer sufferers began arriving from Kansas, Michigan, Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Other than proximity, what does this have to do with Root Street Cemetery? Well, rumors began to circulate that those who did not survive the treatments were secretly buried next door, and that the good doctor was a vivisectionist who would dig up corpses for medical experiments. None of the allegations was ever proved, which still begs the question, if Pond's methods were as successful as they were touted to be, why does no one know what they were? At any rate, after Burr Winton died, Pond became sexton of the cemetery, most likely because he was so close. May 15th, 1880. The Beacon contained an article stating that 4 boys entered Root Street armed with hatchets and destroyed tombstones and attacked the trees and bushes. It would be difficult to estimate the damage done, but certainly it will take several $100s to replace the ruined marble. Burr Winton took out warrants for the arrest of these vandals. According to the article, the eldest boy was fined at $10 and costs. Whether the parents will be called upon to settle the bill of damages, we do not know. 6 years later, to the very day, yet another newspaper article appeared. This one indicated that the grounds were in a sadly dilapidated condition. The gravel walks are overgrown with grass and weeds, and the graves look unkempt. There was probably not half a dozen monuments in the entire cemetery that would stand a plumber's test, being pointed in all directions, and a glance down the rows having the appearance of an old-fashioned rail fence. Dr. Pond was appointed sexton of the cemetery some months since. To remedy the condition of affairs, the doctor announces that all lot owners who can do so should meet at the cemetery next Thursday morning and unite in the work of repairs. In 1894, the city was engaged in sewer work, and in digging up a corner of the grounds, uncovered the remains of 6 or 8 skeletons, 2 of them in one coffin. It was speculated that the dig had gone through a portion of the potter's field, but this already shows that people were forgetting just how bodies were buried at Root Street. The next major insult came in 1919 when Alderman Leonard Moss proposed removing the bodies and making the land a playground. I'm going to suggest that the Playgrounds Commission buy a small lot outside the city limits. We will then attempt to find relatives of the few persons whose remains are still in the cemetery and secure permission to have the remains removed to the lot. I doubt whether we will be able to find any of the relatives, and in that event, the city will have the power to move the bodies. Fortunately, this plan went nowhere, and my question is, how would they even begin to know where to look for remains? Sadly, the citizens of Aurora did not perceive any need to preserve this site, which chronicled the lives of so many important figures in the city's early history. Among those whose final resting place is unknown is the Reverend John Clark, who died of cholera in 1854. Clark was a nationally known figure for whom Clark Street in Chicago is named. He was also a man instrumental in pushing for the establishment of a seminary in Aurora. A few years after his death, his efforts came to fruition with the opening of Clark, later Jennings Seminary. Jack Holzlog, chairman of the effort, noted, "The headstones have been overturned and many of the graves cannot be recognized as such. Young boys have toppled over many of the grave markers by throwing stones and rocks at them, and they have gone so far as to use some of the headstones as bases in an improvised baseball diamond." Through fundraising, by subscriptions, and the sale of bronze memorial plaques, long since gone, the group raised enough money to have the area enclosed by a fence. In 1935 came perhaps the greatest insult to the memory of those interred at Root Street, when the mayor ordered the park commissioner to gather all of the fallen stones and chip them to use for fill at the Phillips Park golf course. Through the years, other Beacon articles appeared that lamented the deplorable state of the cemetery. Wanton destruction, time, and circumstance have exacted a heavy toll at Root Street Cemetery. Thanks to the vast majority of the tombstones being obliterated, so few records to provide any clues to final resting places, and the long-ago deaths of those who might have been able to shed some light on the matter, there is very little left to save. What scanty remains we see today are a sad reflection on how easy it can be for destruction and neglect to almost completely erase the history of a people. Among the few remains is a commemorative area dedicated in May 2005 to those Civil War soldiers who are still believed to be buried somewhere under this sad and neglected cemetery. We now move over to the Catholic cemeteries of the Northeast dedicated to the saints. Our first graveyard is St. Joseph Cemetery, located on the east side of Route 25, just north of the intersection with Indian Trail Road. St. Joseph Parish, like Annunciation, was established because of the logistics of getting to services. The Big Woods Church continued to be considered too far away, and the closest Catholic house of worship, St. Nicholas, meant the danger of having to cross several railroad tracks. A new church celebrated its first Mass October 1st, 1899, and St. Joseph Cemetery was founded December 3rd, 1903, with the purchase of 26 acres of farmland from Nicholas Fritsch. The first burial took place there just 9 days later, when Maria Wohensinger's remains were moved from St. Nicholas Cemetery. The grounds received their official blessing on June 17, 1906, courtesy of the Right Reverend Bishop Alex J. McGavrick. One of the main features of this cemetery is the crucifix group installed in 1941, complete with statuary. Here you will find the grave sites of St. Joseph's priests. 6 years later, an additional 4.5 acres of land was added to bring St. Joseph's Cemetery to its present size. Like nearby Marywood Cemetery, St. Joseph also was popular with the Luxembourger community, as evidenced by the many Germanic names of those laid to rest here. The history of St. Michael Parish began with a Mass celebrated July 21, 1907, the very first in Aurora to be conducted in the Romanian language. This service led to a desire for a church that would be dedicated to our Romanian immigrants, and they started a collection to raise funds to make their hope a reality. Construction of St. Michael Romanian Byzantine Catholic Church began in 1908, and the completed building was dedicated July 4, 1909. A cemetery adjunct was in some use sometime before 1919. Originally, there was a ditch running through the lower portion of the land that was bridged. The grounds were subsequently enlarged by 2.5 more acres. The gate to St. Michael Cemetery, on the east side of Route 25, is located just south of Mitchell Road. Upon entrance, you are greeted by a large metal cross where the two access roads split. I tend not to visit this graveyard very often. Every time I go, I get an odd vibe about the place. I mentioned this to another local who also spends a lot of time visiting cemeteries, and her response was, "Thank you." She also picks up on this feeling when she's at St. Michael. Neither of us can explain exactly why we have this sensation, and there have been no reports of any paranormal activity taking place here. On to St. Nicholas Cemetery, which can be found at the intersection of Ohio and Fenton Streets on the east side of Aurora. As with St. Michael's Cemetery above dedicated to the Romanian settlers who attended their worship services, St. Nicholas was established to receive the remains of the parishioners of St. Nicholas Church. The burial ground dates from 1863, and its grave sites honor many of the German and Luxembourger families who settled in Aurora. St. Nicholas has the distinction of hosting the remains of Philip Jungels, the very first Luxembourger settler of the nearby Big Woods. One impressive monument at St. Nicholas Cemetery is dedicated to the Right Reverend Monsignor Magnus Ambrose Schumacher. Schumacher was born September 6, 1885 in Formosa, Canada, and joined the Rockford Diocese in 1911. Schumacher led the Aurora Church for 43 years from 1924 to 1967. During his tenure, Schumacher remodeled the church and the parish hall, upgraded St. Nicholas Cemetery to beautify the grounds, and was able to construct a new convent and school. Schumacher was appointed by the diocese to head the Aurora Deanery in 1940. He was a prolific writer, authoring How to Teach Catechism, I Teach Catechism, and The Way to God. All of these were multi-volume sets, and copies of them can be found in the Wegman Genealogy Local History Room at the Santori Library. Rejected suitor Anthony Petrus was suspected of being the culprit. He had made threats in which he swore to kill Teresa should she marry another man. This, despite the fact that Petrus had already married someone else instead, out of spite. He was tried twice for the murder, but was acquitted both times for lack of any hard evidence. Despite two subsequent murders in the next 13 months, also involving a pipe or pipe wrench, no one was ever brought to justice for these crimes, and there are claims that Teresa Hollander's spirit has been seen on the cemetery grounds. One particularly grisly tale associated with this cemetery took place on the evening of February 16, 1914. Teresa Hollander and her father had been at a social event in downtown Aurora that evening, and she left early to return home. She never arrived. When her father got back, he assumed she was already in bed, and the family did not discover she was missing until the next morning. Once it was established that she was not at home, her parents began tracking the path to the closest streetcar stop. They found blood on the sidewalk leading into the cemetery and discovered her badly battered body inside. Teresa Hollander, 3 weeks away from her 20th birthday, had been clubbed to death by a pipe or pipe wrench.